For millions of people around the world, Armageddon is not just a biblical prophecy. It is an imminent threat, a constant terror, and for many, the only path to salvation. But what if I told you that in the hands of certain organizations, this promise of a new world transforms into the most potent weapon of psychological control? In this presentation, we will dive deep into the doctrine of Armageddon as taught by the Watchtower, the organization behind Jehovah's Witnesses, to uncover why and how this apocalyptic prophecy has become the centerpiece of a coercive system that promises eternal life while, paradoxically, imprisoning minds and hearts within a cult. The concept of Armageddon itself is ancient, rooted in biblical tradition and religious imagery that has captivated humanity for thousands of years. The word itself derives from the Hebrew Har Megiddo, referring to the mountain region of Megiddo in ancient Israel, a site of numerous historical battles. In Christian eschatology, Armageddon represents the final confrontation between good and evil, the ultimate battle that will usher in God's kingdom on earth. This imagery is powerful, visceral, and deeply embedded in our collective consciousness. However, what we will explore today goes far beyond theological interpretation or religious belief. We are examining how a specific organization has weaponized this ancient prophecy, transforming it from a matter of faith into an instrument of control so sophisticated and pervasive that it affects every aspect of its followers' lives. The Watchtower Society has taken the concept of Armageddon and refined it into a multi-layered system of manipulation that operates on psychological, social, emotional, and spiritual levels simultaneously. This is not about attacking faith itself or diminishing the sincere beliefs of millions. Rather, it is about exposing the mechanisms through which those beliefs are shaped, manipulated, and exploited for organizational control. It is about understanding how the promise of paradise can become a prison, how the hope of salvation can be twisted into a tool of subjugation, and how the fear of destruction can silence critical thinking and personal autonomy. The Watchtower organization has perfected the art of using Armageddon as leverage. They have created a doctrinal framework where this prophesied event is not simply a future occurrence to be contemplated, but an ever-present reality that shapes daily decisions, relationships, and the very identity of each member. The genius of this system lies in its ability to make Armageddon feel both terrifyingly imminent and conveniently postponable, close enough to maintain urgency but distant enough to explain why it hasn't arrived yet. What makes this particular use of Armageddon so effective as a control mechanism is its totality. It is not just about fear, though fear plays a crucial role. It is not just about promise, though the vision of paradise is central. It is not just about exclusivity, though the claim to be God's sole channel is fundamental. It is about how all these elements work together, reinforcing each other in a self-sustaining cycle that becomes increasingly difficult to escape the longer one remains within its influence. As we proceed through this analysis, we will examine 4 primary ways in which the Watchtower employs Armageddon as a control weapon. We will see how constant fear and urgency prevent questioning, how claims of exclusive salvation create total dependency, how organizational policies are justified through apocalyptic necessity, and how the promise of reward keeps members compliant despite the costs. Each of these elements alone would be powerful. Together, they create a nearly inescapable psychological trap. The foundation of the Watchtower's control system rests on the construction of fear, a fear so pervasive and so deeply ingrained that it becomes part of the member's psychological makeup. This is not the abstract, philosophical contemplation of mortality that all humans experience. This is immediate, personal, and terrifyingly specific. The Watchtower paints a vivid and horrifying picture of an Armageddon so close that it could arrive at any moment, where all who are not Jehovah's Witnesses will be summarily destroyed by God Himself. This is not presented as metaphor or allegory. The destruction is described in graphic, literal terms. Publications show images of buildings crumbling, of chaos and devastation, of a world in its final death throes. The message is unmistakable. Everyone outside the organization will die, and die soon. Families will be torn apart, friends will perish, colleagues will be destroyed. Children are taught from the earliest age to visualize this destruction, to understand that their classmates, their neighbors, perhaps even family members who have left the organization, will not survive God's judgment. The psychological impact of this constant exposure to apocalyptic imagery cannot be overstated. From childhood, Jehovah's Witnesses are conditioned to see the world as divided into 2 camps, those who will survive and those who will perish. There is no middle ground, no nuance, no possibility of alternative outcomes. This binary worldview creates a siege mentality where the organization becomes a fortress of safety in a doomed world. But the true genius of this fear-based control lies not just in the threat itself, but in its timing. Since its inception, the Watchtower has proclaimed that the end is near. This is not a new phenomenon. It is baked into the organization's DNA. The founder, Charles Taze Russell, predicted Christ's invisible return in 1874 and expected the end of worldly governments in 1914. When 1914 passed without the expected events, the prophecy was reinterpreted, but the urgency remained. The organization pointed to 1925 as another significant date, suggesting that the ancient worthies would be resurrected and the earthly phase of God's kingdom would begin. Publications encouraged followers to defer major life decisions, to avoid planning for a future that would not come. When 1925 passed uneventfully, membership dropped, but the organization adapted and continued. Perhaps most significantly, the year 1975 was heavily promoted as marking 6,000 years of human history, with strong implications that Armageddon would arrive around that time. Members sold homes, refused medical treatment, abandoned education, all in anticipation of the end. When 1975 came and went, the disappointment was crushing, but the organization shifted blame to members for reading too much into the chronology, while never truly apologizing for the false expectations they had deliberately cultivated. And yet, despite these repeated failures, despite decades of incorrect predictions, the sense of urgency never diminishes. The organization has developed sophisticated language to maintain this tension. They speak of being in the last days of the last days, and the final part of the final part of the last days. They point to world events, natural disasters, wars, and social changes as signs that Armageddon is imminent, even though such events have occurred throughout human history. This constant state of emergency serves multiple control functions. First, it prevents long-term planning and thinking. Why pursue higher education when the end is coming? Why save for retirement when you won't need it? Why invest in deep friendships outside the organization when everyone will soon be destroyed? This short-term thinking keeps members dependent and prevents them from building the resources and relationships that might allow them to question or leave. Second, the urgency justifies the organization's demands on members' time and energy. The Watchtower requires extensive participation, meetings multiple times per week, personal study, field service, door-to-door preaching, preparation for meetings, assemblies, and conventions. This schedule is exhausting, leaving little time for reflection, outside relationships, or activities that might expose members to alternative viewpoints. But how can anyone complain about being too busy when they're engaged in the urgent, life-saving work of warning people before Armageddon? Third, and perhaps most insidiously, this fear-based urgency creates a psychological state where questioning becomes literally unthinkable. When you believe that your eternal life depends on your loyalty to the organization, when you believe that Armageddon could come at any moment and catch you in a state of doubt, when you've been conditioned to associate any questioning with spiritual death, the mind protects itself by refusing to engage with doubts. This is not a conscious choice. It's a defense mechanism that the organization has deliberately cultivated. The constant fear also serves to validate the organization's authority. The Watchtower positions itself as the Ark of Salvation, the only safe harbor in a doomed world. Just as Noah's family found protection in the ark during the flood, Jehovah's Witnesses are told they will find protection in God's organization during Armageddon. This creates a powerful psychological dependence. The very source of the fear becomes the only source of safety. Moreover, this fear is self-reinforcing. The more afraid members become, the more tightly they cling to the organization. The more they invest in the organization, the more they have to lose by questioning it. The more they isolate themselves from outside influences, the fewer resources they have to challenge the fear-based narrative. It becomes a closed loop, a psychological trap that tightens with time. The Watchtower also exploits the natural human tendency toward confirmation bias. When members are primed to see signs of the times everywhere, they begin to interpret world events through that lens. A natural disaster becomes proof of the end times. Political instability confirms the prophecy. Social changes validate the warning. This creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where the world always appears to be getting worse, always seems to be approaching its final moments, regardless of objective reality. This construction of fear and urgency is not accidental. It is not the unfortunate byproduct of sincere belief. It is a carefully designed and deliberately maintained system of control that has evolved over more than a century. The Watchtower has learned from experience how to keep the fear alive while avoiding specific predictions that can be proven wrong. They have mastered the art of creating urgency without accountability, of maintaining crisis without resolution. The second pillar of the Watchtower's control system is the doctrine of exclusive salvation. This is not simply the belief that their interpretation of Christianity is correct. It is the absolute, unshakable conviction that salvation is possible only through association with and obedience to Jehovah's organization, the Watchtower Society. There is no salvation outside of it, no alternative path to life, no possibility that God might show mercy to sincere believers in other traditions. The message is stark and unambiguous: join us or die. This claim to exclusive salvation is woven into every aspect of Watchtower doctrine. Their literature consistently emphasizes that the organization is God's sole channel of communication with humanity. Just as the Israelites in ancient times were God's chosen people, Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that they are the modern-day equivalent, the only group through whom God works. To reject the organization is to reject God Himself. To leave the organization is to abandon the only path to eternal life. The theological framework supporting this claim is elaborate. The Watchtower teaches that there are two classes of saved individuals: the 144,000 anointed, who will reign with Christ in heaven, and the great crowd, who will survive Armageddon and live forever on a restored paradise earth. But crucially, both groups can only achieve salvation through the organization. The anointed must remain faithful members until death, and the great crowd must survive Armageddon by being active, obedient witnesses. This creates a spiritual monopoly unlike anything seen in mainstream Christianity. While most Christian denominations believe they have the truth and may view other groups as misguided, few claim that God will literally destroy everyone who doesn't belong to their specific organization. The Watchtower goes further, teaching that even sincere, devout Christians in other churches, even those who worship God with all their heart but happen to be Baptist or Catholic or any other denomination, will be destroyed at Armageddon simply because they're not Jehovah's Witnesses. The implications of this doctrine for control are profound. It creates total psychological dependence on the organization. A member cannot think, well, if I leave, at least I can still have a relationship with God. No, leaving means death. They cannot think, maybe I can worship God in my own way. No, only the organization's way leads to life. They cannot even think, surely God will understand my doubts. No, doubts are dangerous, potentially fatal. This exclusivity is reinforced by the organization's interpretation of biblical texts. They point to scriptures about being no part of the world, about remaining separate from worldly influences, about the narrow path to life. These texts are used to justify total separation from mainstream society and from anyone who doesn't share their beliefs. The world outside is not just wrong, it is under Satan's control, part of his system, and destined for destruction. All governments, according to Watchtower teaching, are part of Satan's system. All other religions are false religion, part of Babylon the Great, that will be destroyed. All social institutions, educational systems, entertainment industries, and cultural practices are tainted by worldly thinking and dangerous to spiritual health. This comprehensive condemnation of everything outside the organization creates profound social and psychological isolation. Members are taught to view worldly people with suspicion and pity. These are people who are, through no fault of their own in some cases, but often through willful rejection of the truth, in the Watchtower's view, walking toward destruction. Developing close friendships with such people is discouraged because they could be a bad influence, leading the witness away from the organization. Even family relationships with non-witnesses are to be limited to what is absolutely necessary. This isolation serves multiple control functions. First, it prevents exposure to alternative viewpoints. When your entire social network consists of people who share the same beliefs, when everyone you trust accepts the organization's authority without question, it becomes nearly impossible to maintain perspective. The organization's worldview becomes your worldview simply because you have no other frame of reference. Second, isolation increases dependence on the organization for all social and emotional needs. Your friends are all witnesses. Your social activities revolve around meetings and service. Your support system, your sense of community, your very identity are all tied to the organization. This makes leaving psychologically devastating. You're not just leaving a religion, you're losing your entire world. Third, This exclusivity creates a powerful in-group/out-group dynamic that reinforces loyalty. Humans have a natural tendency toward tribalism, toward identifying with a group and viewing outsiders with suspicion. The Watchtower exploits this tendency masterfully. By teaching that they are the only ones who will survive, they create an elite identity, a sense of being special, chosen, favored by God. This is deeply appealing psychologically and creates strong emotional investment in maintaining group membership. The doctrine of exclusive salvation also functions as a self-fulfilling prophecy in terms of member retention. When someone begins to have doubts, they face a terrible choice: suppress those doubts and remain in the organization, or follow their conscience and lose everything: their eternal life, their community, often their family. The stakes are so high that most choose to suppress doubt rather than risk the consequences of leaving. This keeps people trapped even when they no longer truly believe. Moreover, the organization has developed sophisticated mechanisms to prevent members from even encountering ideas that might challenge the exclusivity claim. They warn against independent thinking, against consulting sources outside the organization, against even listening to former members or critics. This information control ensures that members never seriously examine whether the claim to exclusive salvation has any merit. The exclusivity doctrine also serves to maintain organizational authority in the face of failures and contradictions. When prophecies fail, when policies harm people, when scandals emerge, members cannot allow themselves to fully process these problems because doing so would mean questioning the organization, and questioning the organization means risking their salvation. The cost of acknowledging that the organization might be wrong about something is simply too high. This creates a psychological trap where cognitive dissonance is resolved in favor of the organization every time. If reality contradicts what the organization teaches, it must be reality that is wrong, not the organization. If you feel that a teaching is unjust or unloving, it must be your understanding that is flawed, not the teaching. The doctrine of exclusive salvation makes it psychologically impossible to maintain one's belief in personal salvation while questioning the organization. The third dimension of Armageddon's role as a control weapon lies in how it is used to justify and enforce the Watchtower's strict policies and rules. The apocalyptic framework provides the ultimate rationalization for organizational demands that might otherwise seem unreasonable, intrusive, or even harmful. When survival through Armageddon is at stake, no sacrifice is too great, no rule too strict, no policy too invasive. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating of these policies is the practice of disfellowshipping, the Watchtower's equivalent of excommunication. When someone is disfellowshipped, whether for doctrinal disagreement, moral transgression, or simply questioning organizational authority, they are completely cut off from all social contact with Jehovah's Witnesses. Family members are instructed not to speak to them, not to share meals with them, not even to greet them. The only exceptions are minimal necessary business and family matters living under the same roof, though even these interactions are to be kept to an absolute minimum. The terror of disfellowshipping goes beyond the immediate social consequences, as devastating as those are. According to Watchtower teaching, a disfellowshipped person who dies before being reinstated will not survive Armageddon. They are marked for destruction. This means that being disfellowshipped is not just losing your community, it's losing your eternal life. The organization literally holds the power of life and death over its members. This creates an environment of extreme conformity and fear. Members police their own behavior and the behavior of others, knowing that any deviation from organizational rules could result in disfellowshipping and thus destruction at Armageddon. The threat doesn't need to be stated explicitly. It's woven into the fabric of the belief system. Every rule, no matter how minor it might seem, becomes a matter of eternal life or death. The Watchtower's blood transfusion policy provides another stark example of how Armageddon is used to enforce potentially harmful rules. The organization interprets certain biblical passages as prohibiting the consumption of blood, and extends this to ban blood transfusions, even in life-threatening situations. Members are expected to refuse blood transfusions even if it means their death or the death of their children. The justification for this policy is framed in terms of obedience to God's law, but the underlying mechanism is Armageddon. Members are taught that accepting a blood transfusion would mean displeasing God, jeopardizing their relationship with Him, and thus their survival through Armageddon. Even if refusing blood costs your life now, accepting it would cost you eternal life. The calculation is clear. Better to die now and be resurrected into paradise than to live a few more years but be destroyed at Armageddon. This policy has resulted in numerous preventable deaths, including children. Yet the organization presents these deaths as martyrdom, as evidence of faith, as examples to be followed. The families of those who die are comforted with the promise that their loved ones will be resurrected because they remained faithful unto death. The psychological manipulation is staggering. A policy that causes death is presented as the path to life. The organization's stance on political neutrality provides another example. Jehovah's Witnesses are forbidden from voting, serving in the military, saluting flags, or participating in patriotic ceremonies. These prohibitions are justified by the teaching that Christians must remain no part of the world, and that all worldly governments are part of Satan's system that will be destroyed at Armageddon. Members who violate these policies face disfellowshipping. In some countries, this neutrality has resulted in imprisonment, persecution, and even death. Yet the organization presents these consequences as proof of faithfulness, as persecution for righteousness' sake, as badges of honor. The suffering caused by these policies is reframed as necessary for survival through Armageddon. To compromise on neutrality would be to compromise one's salvation. Even seemingly minor rules are given weight through the Armageddon framework. Witnesses are discouraged from celebrating holidays like Christmas and birthdays, which the organization labels as pagan or displeasing to God. They are expected to reject certain career paths, avoid certain entertainment, regulate their personal appearance according to organizational standards, and limit their interactions with non-witnesses. Each of these rules, individually, might seem like a matter of personal conscience or religious preference. But within the Watchtower system, they become survival issues. Every rule is connected to the larger framework of maintaining God's favor, staying in good standing with the organization, and thus ensuring survival through Armageddon. This elevates even trivial matters to eternal significance. The organization also controls information, discouraging members from reading critical materials, consulting outside sources about their beliefs, or even having in-depth conversations with former members. This information control is justified as spiritual protection. Critical information is labeled as apostate material, spiritually dangerous, coming from Satan. Exposing yourself to such information is portrayed as spiritual suicide, putting your salvation at risk. This information control prevents members from accessing facts that might lead them to question the organization. They never hear the full story of failed prophecies, never read detailed analyses of doctrinal contradictions, never encounter the testimonies of former members who found happiness and spirituality outside the organization. This isolation from contrary information ensures that the Armageddon-based control system remains unchallenged. The organization's approach to education further demonstrates how Armageddon justifies restrictive policies. Higher education is strongly discouraged, with organizational publications warning that colleges are hotbeds of immorality, atheism, and dangerous thinking. Young witnesses are encouraged to pursue only the minimum education necessary to support themselves in simple jobs, and to focus their energies on organizational activities instead. The rationale is clear. Why spend years in college when Armageddon is coming soon? Why invest in a career when the world system is about to be destroyed? Why expose yourself to worldly philosophy and critical thinking when such education could undermine your faith and cost you your eternal life? This policy keeps members economically dependent and intellectually isolated, both of which reinforce organizational control. The organization even regulates intimate aspects of members' lives, including sexuality and marriage. Detailed rules govern what sexual practices are acceptable even within marriage, with violations potentially resulting in disfellowshipping. These intrusive rules are justified as maintaining moral purity necessary for survival through Armageddon. The organization positions itself as the interpreter of God's standards, and members must comply or risk destruction. What makes all of these policies so effective as control mechanisms is that they're not enforced primarily through external pressure, but through internalized fear. Members police themselves because they believe their eternal life depends on compliance. They don't follow the rules just because the elders are watching. They follow them because they believe God is watching, and that any deviation could cost them everything at Armageddon. This internalized control is far more powerful than external enforcement could ever be. It means that members carry the organization's authority with them at all times, in every situation, in every decision. The threat of Armageddon becomes an internal voice, a constant presence that shapes thought and behavior even when no other witnesses are around. While fear and restriction form the stick of Watchtower control, the promise of paradise provides the carrot. The organization's vision of the post-Armageddon world is beautiful, compelling, and deeply appealing. It offers everything that humans long for: eternal life, perfect health, reunions with deceased loved ones, meaningful work, abundant resources, peace, and harmony. This paradise Earth is not presented as a vague spiritual concept but as a literal, physical reality that faithful witnesses will experience. The imagery used to portray this paradise is carefully crafted to appeal to deep human desires. Publications show beautiful landscapes, happy families playing with formerly wild animals, perfect homes and gardens, abundant fruit and vegetables, people of all ages and ethnicities living together in harmony. There is no death, no disease, no poverty, no war, no crime. It is humanity's oldest dream, a return to Eden, but even better because it will last forever. This vision serves multiple control functions. First, it provides motivation to endure present hardships. When life in the organization becomes difficult, when the rules feel oppressive, when the demands seem excessive, members are reminded of the reward awaiting them. The promise of paradise makes present suffering bearable, even meaningful. Every sacrifice becomes an investment in an eternal future. The paradise promise also provides rationalization for the organization's strict policies. Why give up celebrating holidays? Because you're going to celebrate forever in paradise. Why limit your education and career? Because you're going to have eternally meaningful work in the new world. Why sacrifice relationships with worldly family and friends? Because you'll have perfect relationships with people who love Jehovah in paradise. Moreover, the specific and detailed nature of the paradise teaching makes it psychologically powerful. Unlike abstract promises of heaven, the Watchtower's paradise Earth is concrete and imaginable. Members are encouraged to visualize themselves in paradise, to imagine what they'll do, who they'll see, how they'll feel. This mental rehearsal creates emotional attachment to the vision and reinforces commitment to the organization that promises to deliver it. The organization skillfully uses the paradise hope to answer objections and maintain morale. When members struggle with doctrinal contradictions, they're reminded that all will be clear in paradise. When they question why God allows suffering, they're told to wait for the paradise when all will be made right. When they're hurt by organizational policies, they're counseled to focus on the eternal reward rather than temporary difficulties. The paradise promise also serves to defer justice and resolution. Members who have been wronged, who have suffered injustice, who have legitimate grievances are taught to wait on Jehovah. The implication is that while justice may not come now, it will certainly come in paradise. This prevents members from demanding accountability or change in the present, as they believe that ultimate justice is coming after Armageddon. This deferral of justice is particularly insidious in cases of abuse or serious wrongdoing within the organization. Victims are often counseled to be patient, to forgive, to trust that Jehovah will handle matters in his due time. This protects perpetrators and the organization from accountability while keeping victims compliant with the promise that their suffering will be acknowledged and compensated in paradise. The other key element of this reward system is the interpretation of opposition and difficulty as signs of faith and evidence that Armageddon is near. The organization teaches that persecution is to be expected, that it's actually a mark of true Christianity. Jesus said his followers would be hated, so when Jehovah's Witnesses face criticism or opposition, it's presented as confirmation that they have the truth. This creates a psychological phenomenon where negative feedback is transformed into positive reinforcement. When the organization or its doctrines are criticized, members don't think, maybe there's something to this criticism. Instead, they think, this persecution proves we're right. When former members share their negative experiences, current members see this as apostasy and further proof of their own righteous path. Every challenge to the organization becomes evidence supporting it. The concept of persecution also serves to tighten group cohesion. When members feel attacked from outside, they draw closer together and more firmly align with the organization. The organization actively cultivates a persecution complex, regularly reminding members of past persecution, highlighting any current opposition, and warning of intensified persecution as Armageddon approaches. This persecution narrative also provides an explanation for why the organization is not more widely accepted. If they truly have the truth, why don't more people believe it? Because Satan is blinding people's minds. Because the world hates righteousness. Because persecution is evidence of authenticity. The lack of widespread acceptance, which could be seen as evidence against their claims, is instead presented as evidence for them. The organization particularly emphasizes government restrictions or bans on their activities as evidence of persecution and a sign of the end times. When authorities limit their preaching work, when courts rule against them, when former members speak out, all of this is packaged as persecution. Members are taught to see themselves as brave warriors for truth, standing firm against a hostile world, which feeds into a heroic self-image that reinforces commitment. The Watchtower also selectively highlights examples of persecution from their history, particularly periods when they faced genuine religious persecution, such as under Nazi Germany. These historical examples are used to create a persecution identity, making modern members feel connected to a tradition of martyrdom and faithfulness. Any current difficulties, no matter how different from actual persecution, are linked to this history to magnify their significance. This persecution complex makes members resistant to criticism and closed to outside perspectives. Any negative information about the organization is automatically categorized as persecution, as lies from Satan, as attacks from apostates. This creates an immunization against critical thinking. Members have been pre-programmed to reject anything negative about the organization, not by examining its merits, but by categorizing it as persecution. The promise of paradise combined with the persecution narrative creates a powerful psychological loop. Present suffering, whether from organizational demands, social isolation, or external criticism, is reinterpreted as evidence of faithfulness that guarantees future reward. The harder the present circumstances, the more certain the paradise hope becomes. This makes it almost impossible to break free because every negative experience strengthens rather than weakens commitment. The organization even uses the deferred paradise hope to explain away their own failures. When prophecies don't come true, when promises aren't fulfilled, when expectations are disappointed, members are counseled to be patient and wait for the real fulfillment in paradise. The organization's track record of failure becomes irrelevant when the ultimate fulfillment is always just ahead, always just beyond Armageddon. This future orientation also prevents members from fully living in the present. They're taught to see current life as temporary, as a waiting period, as something to be endured rather than experienced. This reduces the likelihood that they'll invest in present happiness, build lasting relationships outside the organization, or pursue personal goals that might lead them away from organizational control. They're perpetually waiting, perpetually preparing, perpetually sacrificing present reality for future promise. The paradise hope also exploits the universal human fear of death. Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that they need never die, that they can live right through Armageddon into eternal life. This is an incredibly powerful promise, tapping into our deepest anxieties and desires. The fear of death becomes another lever of control. Leave the organization and you'll die at Armageddon. Stay faithful and you'll never have to face death at all. As we reach the end of this analysis, it becomes abundantly clear that the doctrine of Armageddon, within the context of the Watchtower organization, transcends mere biblical prophecy. It has been meticulously constructed and weaponized as a multifaceted tool of control, operating through the fear of destruction, the promise of exclusive salvation, the enforcement of rigid rules, and the offer of a paradisiacal reward. This mechanism of control is sophisticated, comprehensive, and devastatingly effective. It operates on multiple levels simultaneously, addressing different psychological needs and exploiting different human vulnerabilities. The fear of Armageddon silences questioning and creates urgency. The claim of exclusive salvation generates total dependency. The justification of strict policies through apocalyptic necessity ensures compliance. The promise of paradise provides motivation to endure. Together, these elements create a psychological prison disguised as spiritual freedom. What makes this system particularly insidious is its self-reinforcing nature. Each element strengthens the others. Fear drives members toward the organization, which claims exclusive salvation, which justifies its strict rules, which are made bearable by the paradise promise, which is confirmed by persecution, which increases fear and dependence. It's a closed loop, a system designed to resist challenges from both inside and outside. The human cost of this system is staggering. Millions of people live under the constant shadow of Armageddon, making decisions not based on their own judgment, values, or aspirations, but on what they believe is necessary to survive God's judgment. Families are torn apart by shunning policies. Children grow up in fear rather than security. Individuals suppress their doubts, questions, and authentic selves to maintain standing with an organization that holds their eternal life hostage. Educational opportunities are sacrificed, careers are limited, medical treatment is refused, relationships are destroyed, all because the organization has successfully convinced its members that their survival depends on absolute obedience. People who might otherwise live full, rich, meaningful lives instead exist in a state of perpetual anxiety, always watching, always performing, always afraid that one misstep could cost them everything. The tragedy is compounded by the fact that many Jehovah's Witnesses are sincere, kind, well-meaning people who genuinely believe they are serving God and helping others. They are not malicious. They are victims of a system that has shaped their understanding of reality. They truly believe that the organization's rules are God's rules, that the paradise promise is God's promise, that the threat of Armageddon is God's warning. They cannot see the manipulation because they have been conditioned not to see it. But we must ask the fundamental questions that this analysis raises. Does genuine faith require this level of control? Must true spirituality operate through fear and exclusivity? Is this really what a loving God would demand of his followers? Or has the Watchtower organization taken sacred concepts and corrupted them, twisting biblical prophecy into a tool for human control? The evidence suggests the latter. When we examine how Armageddon functions within the Watchtower system, we see not the working of divine justice, but the mechanics of human manipulation. We see psychological techniques that have been refined over more than a century to maximize control and minimize dissent. We see an organization that benefits enormously from keeping its members in a state of fear and dependency. The Watchtower claims to represent God, to speak with his authority, to be his sole channel of communication with humanity. But the methods they employ, the fear they cultivate, the lives they restrict, the families they tear apart, all in the name of surviving Armageddon, these things bear examination. Is this the behavior we would expect from an organization truly guided by a loving God? Or is it the behavior of an institution primarily concerned with maintaining its own power and authority? The doctrine of Armageddon, as presented by the Watchtower, serves a purpose far more earthly than divine. It keeps millions of people obedient to an organization, controlled in their thinking, limited in their opportunities, and isolated from alternative perspectives. It silences dissent, punishes questioning, and rewards conformity. It transforms a message of hope into an instrument of fear, a promise of life into a threat of death. This is not about dismissing all religious belief or mocking sincere faith. Many people find meaning, community, and purpose in religious practice, and that deserves respect. But there is a fundamental difference between faith that liberates and faith that imprisons, between belief that empowers and belief that controls, between hope that inspires and hope that is used as leverage. The Watchtower's use of Armageddon falls firmly into the latter category. It does not liberate, it binds. It does not empower, it restricts. It does not inspire hope, it weaponizes it. The promise of eternal life becomes a chain that keeps members locked in a system that serves the organization's interests rather than the spiritual well-being of its followers. It is time to question, to examine, to think critically about these mechanisms of control. It is time to ask whether the cost of this promised salvation, the sacrifice of autonomy, relationships, opportunities, and even life itself, is justified. It is time to consider whether an organization that operates through fear, exclusivity, and control can truly represent divine love and justice. For those still within the organization, trapped by fear of Armageddon, the path forward may seem impossible. The thought of questioning, of leaving, brings with it the terror of eternal destruction. But it is worth considering. What kind of God would demand absolute obedience to a human organization under threat of death? What kind of love operates through fear and coercion? What kind of truth cannot withstand honest questioning? For those who have left or are considering leaving, there is life beyond the Watchtower's Armageddon. There are communities of support, people who understand, paths to healing and recovery. The fear lessens with time and distance. The control weakens when its mechanisms are understood and exposed. Freedom is possible, even from a system as comprehensive and sophisticated as this one. The greatest weapon against this kind of control is knowledge, understanding how it works, recognizing the techniques, seeing through the manipulation. When you understand that Armageddon has been used not as a divine warning but as an organizational control mechanism, its power begins to diminish. When you recognize the patterns of fear, dependency, and reward that keep people trapped, you can begin to break free. Ultimately, the question we must each answer is this: do we want a faith built on fear or on love? Do we want belief that comes from genuine conviction or from terror of consequences? Do we want to serve God if we believe in God because we choose to, or because we're afraid not to? The Watchtower's Armageddon offers only the latter options. True spiritual freedom requires the former. The organization will likely continue to use Armageddon as its primary control weapon. It has worked for over a century, and they have refined it to near perfection. But more people are beginning to see through it, to recognize it for what it is, to question whether this is really what faith should look like. More people are choosing freedom over fear, authenticity over performance, genuine relationships over organizational approval. This is not the end of the story. The Watchtower organization will adapt, as it always has, finding new ways to maintain control, new explanations for failed prophecies, new urgency to replace the old. But each person who breaks free, who chooses to think critically, who refuses to be controlled by fear, represents a victory of human dignity over manipulation. The doctrine of Armageddon, as wielded by the Watchtower, is indeed a powerful weapon. But it is a weapon that loses its power when exposed to light, when subjected to scrutiny, when its mechanisms are understood. It is time to shine that light, to ask those hard questions, to refuse to accept control masquerading as salvation. It is time to recognize that genuine faith, if that is what one seeks, does not require the surrender of one's mind, one's relationships, or one's freedom to an organization that uses the threat of divine destruction to maintain earthly power. The Watchtower has made Armageddon its greatest weapon, but it doesn't have to be ours. We can choose a different path, one not based on fear of destruction but on hope for genuine understanding, authentic relationships, and true freedom of conscience. We can recognize control for what it is, even when it comes wrapped in religious language and promises of paradise. And we can, if we choose, walk away from the weapon entirely, refusing to let fear of a manipulated prophecy determine how we live our lives. That is the message we must carry forward, that Armageddon, as presented by the Watchtower, serves not the purposes of divine justice but the needs of organizational control. And that recognizing this truth, however difficult, is the first step toward genuine freedom.